Hello, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Clint Smith. I am a staff writer at The Atlantic and a 2020, I think that's right, Emerson Fellow with New America. And I am here and very lucky to be joined by my friend and someone who I look up to very much, the esteemed, the one and only Patrick Radden Keefe. Patrick, as many of you know, is a longtime staff writer at The New Yorker. He's the author of five books, including Say Nothing, Empire Pain, Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty, which received the Bally Guilford Prize, was a finalist for the Financial Times Business Book of the Year award. Also just had a huge policy impact across this country. There was Rogues, there's the Rogues, True Story of Grifters, Killers, Rebels, Crooks. He's a New America board member, a former New America fellow, and his investigative journalism has been recognized with a Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Magazine Award for feature writing, and he is the creator and host of the podcast Winds of Change, which was excellent and investigates the strange convergence of heavy metal music and Cold War espionage, and was named #1 podcast of the year by multiple outlets. And he has also worked as a producer for film and television, including the show that we are here to talk about, the incredible Say Nothing, as well as being an executive producer for the Netflix series Painkiller. We are here, as the folks said at the beginning, or the voice of God said at the beginning, copies of the book are available. If for some reason you have not read Say Nothing, you absolutely should do so. If you've read it once, you should read it again. And you can buy the book at the link at the bottom right-hand corner from the independent bookselling partner of New America, Solid State Books. I think I've said all the things I'm supposed to say, and now we'll get to the good part. Patrick, how you doing, man?
I'm great. Thank you so much for doing this, Clint.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the series is amazing, incredible. I remember we got together a few months ago before it came out, and you were really excited, you were really nervous, and we talked a little bit about the process of bringing the book, um, transforming the book into the show, and that's how I'd like to start for the audience. Could you talk a little bit about just, so what was the process like generally of turning this book into a film, and how did you particularly decide that you wanted to be involved at all? Because there are a lot of writers whose books are adapted into films who decide to have a very sort of like give full creative control to the producers, to the showrunners, to the directors. And there are others who decide to be more involved. So I'm curious both how you decided you wanted to be involved. Did you know that you wanted to be a producer? Was there a conversation about you writing the series? Were you on set the whole time? What was that experience like?
Sure, yeah. It's funny. I had worked over the years, kind of part-time, particularly when I was a freelance journalist, as a screenwriter. And I wrote movies that didn't get made, and I wrote TV shows that didn't get made. I was like the proverbial Hollywood screenwriter who, makes a decent living and gets health insurance. Um, but none of it ever actually comes to fruition. And I've had a handful of things over the years optioned that were pieces of nonfiction that I wrote, but I've always had a little bit of a church and state divide. It's like they're two different
Mm,
parts of my brain. I've never adapted myself, never particularly wanted to. And I hadn't actually given too much thought to the notion of this particular book being anything other than what it is. I find doing journalism, I find it extremely distracting. Like I kind of don't want to open up the door to even thinking about what the dramatic possibilities of a thing would be,
mm,
because I sort of think first and foremost the piece of writing has to work on its own terms and just be what it wants to be. But I finished the book, and the didn't hadn't really given too much thought even to sending it out or pitching it to Hollywood or any of that kind of stuff. But there's a guy that I happen to know named Brad Simpson, who is a producer of film and television. He works with a woman named Nina Jacobson, and I had known Brad for many, many years. One of his first jobs was he was a producing partner for Leonardo DiCaprio, and he read my first book, that is Brad did. Um, Came to New York, took me out to lunch, but this was like maybe 10 years before. And we just kind of stayed in touch. And when I was in LA, we'd get together. When he was in New York, we'd get together. and he asked to read Say Nothing when it was in galleys. And Brad and Nina had made The People versus O.J. Simpson, the FX series, which I thought was really kind of an
Incredible series.
yeah,
Yeah.
a kind of exemplary series when it came to um, taking a book and a true story and kind of enlivening it in a dramatic format in a way that felt very relevant at the point where it was released, even though it was
Hmm.
about a historical series of events. And so that counted for a lot to me. And then their pitch to me was they said, "What if you came on board with us as a kind of fellow producer, and you were, wouldn't just be you giving us the rights and we'll go off and make a TV show. You come along with us and actually be involved at every step of the way." And this is, I mean, these conversations are happening in early 2019, so this is 5 years
Wow.
ago,
Yeah.
and that was the way in which we kind of went about deciding to do it at all. And then the notion of me being really involved was appealing, in a number of ways. I mean, one is that Brad and Nina are really smart, and I think um, as somebody who can maybe get a little restless sometimes, and maybe I also sort of just have that kind of reporter's desire to always be learning. I loved the idea of coming along with them and being in every meeting and just kind of soaking it all in and learning
Mm-hmm.
from them. And then also, I felt as though there was a kind of a custodial role that I could play when it came to the book and when it came to the fact that these are true stories, in some cases about people who are still alive. And so I wanted to be in it and always be the voice in the room who is saying, how can we make it more authentic? How can we make this in a way that people in Belfast, the place that the series is about, would recognize if they watched it? And so I was kind of in it from the early going, involved in hiring the writers, and when it came time to casting and locations, and it was a 9 month shoot. I wasn't there for the whole shoot, but I was there kind of continuously for about 2.5 months in the middle, and then I was kind of going back and forth both before and after that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it was an incredible experience. I mean, I learned a great deal, and I felt very strongly from the outset. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but a good adaptation of the book would not be a perfectly faithful adaptation of the book. I think
Yeah.
maybe as a screenwriter, having adapted other people in the past
Yeah.
as a screenwriter, I sort of had an appreciation for the idea that it needs to be its own separate work of art that kind of
Yeah.
functions on a different set of principles. It has to have DNA that is kind of recognizably similar. And I have
Mm.
to say, I'm so pleased with how it's come out. I'm really proud of the result, and seeing it out there in the world has been amazing.
Was it a difficult transition? Because it was, as we know, the life of a writer generally is like a very solitary life. And in this, and to varying degrees, when you're reporting, obviously you're spending time with a lot of people, but when you're doing the writing, it's you, and you have full autonomy over how you want to shape the story, what's included, what's not included. Obviously, your editor comes in, and there are conversations there, but ultimately, it is your story, it is your decision. Um, you carry the full autonomy and agency, but you also carry the full weight of responsibility. And I'm wondering what the experience was like from basically going from a solo project to a group project, right? Because the decisions about casting, decisions about who the writers are, decisions about what things are going to be cut on the back end and what things are going to be included, it sounds like you had an incredible working relationship with your collaborators, which is really um, phenomenal. But I know for myself, I think I think it would be tough to have other hands, have other cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. Was that something that you felt that came sort of naturally to you, that you were able to sort of enter a different headspace and say, look, I'm working in a more collaborative context now? Or were you like, this is my story. Like you guys are kind of, I wonder if there were some moments like that that were tough.
Both. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's funny. I know you grew up playing team sports, and I did too, but my kids play a lot of tennis. And I don't play tennis, I never have, but I watch an inordinate amount of tennis now. And it's fascinating because it's more like writing than anything, in the sense that you
Mm,
are alone on the baseline. Like you're going to get
yeah,
all the credit if it goes well, you're going to get all the blame if it goes badly.
yeah,
a lot of the time, your biggest adversary is really just your own headspace, you know?
Mm,
Um, and I had had a prior experience fairly recently when I made that podcast, Wind of Change.
mm,
That was the first time I really had that feeling that I'd kind of run off and like joined the circus. That I was working with this little team of people, and suddenly I had a crew. Like it was like I had a
okay.
band,
Yeah.
and we traveled around together. And I absolutely had to kind of forfeit a lot of agency and autonomy, as you say. But I also had that incredible experience of the alchemy that can come with um, talking with my producer, talking to a composer or something like that. This is on the podcast I'm talking about
Yeah.
here. And I sort of describe some inchoate idea that I have that I don't even really have the language to fully articulate.
Mm,
And somebody who's so much better and more creative and more brilliant at this stuff than I am takes that kind of very tentative, provisional little notion that I've spun out and goes away for a few days and comes back with something that just seems it's sort of what it's like it's not just what I had in my mind's eye, it's that, but so much better.
mm,
And so I was actually kind of excited for the idea of that, right? Of getting back into a situation where you're working with people who are better than you are.
yeah.
And if it's a good and healthy collaboration, they'll take your good ideas and then riff on them and actually achieve something that you couldn't on your own. And I mean, obviously, in the kind of humbling context of a great big production, that's doubly the case because what do I know about casting and costumes and directing and lighting and all the
Yeah.
rest of it? Um, that aspect of it was incredibly thrilling to
Mm,
see the actors make these choices that in kind of discovering these characters um, that would never have occurred to me that I couldn't have dictated even if I had the idea to see the
mm,
directors find tonal shades, to see the writers bring out kind of little turns of phrase or moments of dramatic irony. All that was hugely exciting. Having said all that, yeah, I mean, it was a struggle for me to be part of a situation in which there's this big enterprise and it grows out of a thing that started in my head
yeah.
and know that I'm a voice in the room. I'm a valued voice in the room. I'm one of a handful of people who are kind of the central brain trust of this big engine. Uh, but I'm not the only one, and I'm not the most important one. And I think there's a part of me that has a kind of natural inclination towards a democracy of ideas, where I feel like we're going to get in the room, we're all going to hash it out, and whoever can kind of advocate for their idea in the most persuasive way will win. And I think of necessity, a TV show can't be that. Um, and so, yeah, absolutely, there were. It was kind of an emotional learning curve for me to get into the place where I could learn to sort of accept the things I could not change,
Yeah.
um, but also learn to love the things that I would never have been able to come up with on my own,
Mm,
and on some level just be kind of in awe of my collaborators.
that's awesome. Uh, you brought this up, and I'm curious to hear more about, obviously in the context of taking a book and turning it into a television series. There's a lot you have to leave out, and there's a lot that changes. I probably even more so if you were to make this into a film. And I think I tell people this all the time. I mean, I'm no TV critic. But I love, like many Americans, I love watching TV. And I think that we are in this remarkable age of television, especially in the context of limited series, where I imagine maybe if this project happened 15 years ago, it would have been turning Say Nothing into a film. And it quite possibly, and I'm almost certainly would have been a beautiful, brilliant film, in the same way the series is. What I love about series is that you have so much more space, right? You have 4 hours or 6 hours or 8 hours or 10 hours to tell a story that previously you might have only had 2.5 hours to tell. And it lets you get so much, for me, there's often so much more depth, so much more context, so much more texture to the characters because you get backstories, you get side stories, you get a sense of people's motivations, sense of people's fears, their traumas that animate their beliefs and their actions now. And so I thought that that's one of the things that was so wonderful about the series. But also, as we said, we had to things that were in the book that felt so central to the book and so meaningful to the book um, had to be cut out for space, for narrative propulsion, for all sorts of reasons. So, for example, one of the most striking parts of the original text was learning more about Brendan Hughes' time in prison. That part is not in the show. So I'm curious, how you all went about what was the process by which you all decided what would and would not be included? And was there some stuff that you decided on the front end, like, okay, this isn't going to work? Or did you film a whole lot of stuff and then kind of figure out in the editing process, actually, we've got to move toward this. This is taking too long. We filmed Brendan in prison, but actually that doesn't work. Was it more on the front end or more on the back end?
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, there's a lot to chew on there. I I know you do too. I mean, I think about these questions of narrative time and narrative length a lot. You think about them anytime you write a piece, right? Does this piece want to be 5,000 words or 10,000 words or 15,000 words? I think about it in the TV context, as you mentioned, because I always felt, if you think about the kind of golden age of the golden age of peak TV, characters like Tony Soprano or Walter White, I always felt as though the Sopranos would never have worked as a feature.
Mm,
Part of the reason for that is that when you watch The Sopranos, I think it's, the incredible moment in the college tour episode where Tony takes his daughter on the college tour up to Maine and he sees the guy who's in witness protection and then he throttles him, he strangles him to death in this very vivid way. That's in episode 5. And it's the
mm,
first, I think, it might be episode 4. It's 4 or 5. It's the first time you see Tony Soprano kill someone. So you've
mm,
had effectively 4 hours to be with this guy and fall in love with him and let him kind of get his hooks into you emotionally. And by the time he does this terrible thing, it's kind of too late. Like you're a goner. You're with him for that ride. There is no off ramp for you at that
yeah,
stage. But I think it only works because they had this luxurious, like long run up, all this runway before you get to him doing the odious things. Same is true in Breaking Bad or any number of these other series. And so that's a thing that I think about a lot is that you need that time. And with Say Nothing, similarly, I mean, the structure is totally different. In a weird way, you start with them doing the bad things for us, but
mm,
it's a lot of what we were thinking about was this kind of what if you take a longitudinal view of people's lives and you're in your early 20s and you're making certain choices and you're doing certain things, and then how do those look from the vantage point of your 50s? And so you kind of need a lot of dramatic time to play with. Having said all that, of course, there's got to be a distillation. And um, I think it's funny, something that I have just recently started thinking about, 20 years into doing this work, is I now increasingly think about writing as not a process of kind of accumulation or addition, but a process of subtraction. That basically I'm doing a huge amount of research and I'm kind of developing this big compost heap of stuff that I've gathered. And then the whole game for me is just like, how much can I take away? How much
right,
can I take away? How do I find the pattern? How do I find the kind of path that's through this thing and then strip away everything that's extraneous? And so I think part of what is strange is as much as Say Nothing, as anybody who's watching and has read the book can probably attest, is a bit of a doorstep. It's a long book. It took me 4 years to do it. But to me, the book feels like this distillation. Like I know all of the stuff. I know that so many of those chapters when I wrote them started out at twice the length and had to
mhm,
be pared back and pared back and pared back. The strangeness of making the show is then you take this thing that to me already feels kind of diamond hard in terms
yeah,
of how much we've distilled it, and you say, okay, what if we distilled it by a further 60 or 70%, right? How lean can we go? And I think that there are, as we, a lot of this to your question about the front end and the back end. a lot of this was happening in the writers' room when we were breaking the story. The budgetary reality in terms of making a show like this is that if you have a decent sense in advance that there's a chance that something might end up getting cut out, you're not going to shoot it. So there was certainly stuff that we shot that we ended up cutting, but by and large, a lot of that distillation happened in this kind of iterative process with the scripts for those episodes. Actually, initially there were 10 episodes. We went down to 9. The
Mm.
episodes were kind of further reduced. And some of it in a kind of storytelling way. Um, when you think about the particulars, it would be obvious. So I think everybody was kind of heartbroken that Brendan Hughes's escape from prison wasn't in the show because, in some ways, it's the most obviously cinematic moment in the book.
Yeah.
But to take an easier example, there were 3 hunger strikes in the book. You get the Price sisters hunger strike,
Mm.
and then the first hunger strike by Brendan Hughes and the other men at Long Kesh, and then the second hunger strike by Bobby Sands and the others. And um, we ended up devoting episode 6, which is an episode I think we all felt really good about, to this incredibly kind of close up, intense, intimate account of the hunger
Mhm.
strike of the Price sisters. And the feeling was you can't you can't do that to people. Like you can't do
Yeah.
that and then say, and episode 7 we're gonna open with another
Here's
hunger
another one.
strike. You
Yeah.
know, like, did you like that? Here's some more.
Yeah.
And so the tricky thing is in dramatic terms, when you meet older Brendan Hughes, played by Tom Von Lawler,
Mm.
part of the reason that that guy is the guy you meet when he's older is that he's been through that hunger strike.
Mm.
And so there's actually all this kind of interesting unspoken stuff where the actor, and the writers know that he's been through that, even if we don't show it to you, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I think it's such an important point. I mean, I think about this, and I think we've had this conversation before, but I think about this all the time in the context of my own work. I mean, I write a lot about historical atrocities, domestically in the context of slavery, or globally now, thinking about my new book project with the memory of World War II. Um, and, having been to Nagasaki and Seoul and Germany and all these places where these horrific mass slaughters and mass deaths and um, mass acts of violence against people happen. It's how do you, in its own way, part of what I was thinking about this when I wrote this piece about Rwanda, like how do you, there's so many iterations of similar stories, and there's an impulse almost to just like give them all, give everything, like every first person testimony, like look at this hunger strike looks different than this one, this killing of a family looks different than this one, this um example of this mass atrocity has a similar or different texture to this one. And I think you want, as an act of bearing witness, almost you want to I know that I often feel this desire to show all of it as much as possible. But to your point, I think um, there's something very powerful about depth rather than breadth. Not always, they're not always mutually exclusive, but there is something. I mean, that episode that you're referring to it's devastating to watch, and I have never watched. I think it's the only. I don't know that I've experienced a depiction of a hunger strike or force feeding. I don't know if I've ever seen that, and certainly not with the level of emotional complexity, right? The relationship between she and the doctor, and the relationship between her and her sister. I mean, it was so devastating and also so human, right? Because it became this thing where um, I think there's a version of the story that can be told where like the doctor is this evil man, this callous man, and everybody, all the nurses don't care. It's but the story is so much richer than that and much more complex than that. And to your point, again, going back to um, something that you can do in a series rather than a film, how much time would there have been in a film to depict that that episode, and would you have been able um, to show the humanity and emotional complexity of all those characters?
Yeah, I mean,
And
the one other thing I would say, and it's funny because I mean, I wonder what it's like for you. Actually, I would almost throw the question back for you, particularly given that that writing about atrocities of the Second World War, but some of it is also your awareness of what else is out there. So in our case, we were focused very much on the hunger strike of these sisters and the fact that they were force fed, as you say. But part of the reason for that was that we knew that Steve McQueen made Hunger already. Like that the movie
Mm,
Hunger is out there, and is tremendously well done about a different kind of hunger strike, right? Where it actually does go all the way, where he's not force fed.
mm,
There's the kind of ironic historic footnote is the reason Bobby Sands wasn't force fed is because of the Price sisters, because they kind of broke the system. They were when the doctors in the UK said, "That's it, we're done." The government said, "Okay, we're not going to force feed people anymore when they go on hunger
mm,
strike," and that's what then allows Bobby Sands and those other
mm.
strikers to die. But we were kind of aware that this thing was out there. I mean, I wonder what it's like for you, because they're on the one hand, there's probably the impulse to say, okay, I want to document all of this. On the other hand, there is such a rich literature that in some ways maybe that's liberating, right? Because you can kind of you can say, like, I'm going to pick my own path here.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, in the context of World War II, I mean, it's probably been written about World War II as a subgenre of nonfiction books is probably the most popular, nonfiction subject to write about. So there's no shortage of literature on the Holocaust or atomic bomb survivors or comfort women survivors or the like. Um, but it is a sort of how do you pick the story that and so in the context of my work, so much of it is about the revelation that I experience through these stories. And so it's this kind of triangulation of my experience encountering this story for the first time, um, and putting it in conversation with the sort of larger body of historiography, um, and using, a story that one person tells me when we are standing in the former site of their home, in Nagasaki before it was blown to bits or burned by the bomb, um, as an entry point to think about a much wider phenomenon that obviously affected so many different people. But there's, as humans, um, I think we are drawn to stories and specificity and single narratives that tap into, there's the thing writers talk about all the time where there's sort of universality in the granular, right? That there's something that somebody in some country that ostensibly has nothing to do with the with Ireland, in this period of time is going to pull and be able to pull from the show and pull from the book and apply it to their own specific cultural, social, and geopolitical context,
Yeah,
and that's
and I think that's doubly true on. I mean, as much as I think that nonfiction prose of the sort that you and I write, uh, is and can be tremendously powerful. I think that when you're dealing with television and drama, it's just so much more visceral. Like
yeah.
there's a sort of there is a kind of power in the medium. I mean, Roger Ebert had that quote about how television is an empathy machine.
Mm,
And I will say, I mean, I have been very surprised by the reaction, a bunch of the reaction, to say nothing. But one thing that has really startled me is the degree to which all kinds of people who actually, like, there's not a lot they agree on when it comes to the Troubles or political violence or, any of the broader issues in play, um, have come to the show with a kind of open mind. And I think it's part of the reason for that is the sort of strange empathetic power of drama
mm, yeah,
that people can kind of they can sort of ease themselves into a point of view that on the page it's much more of an overcome, I think,
yeah.
sometimes.
And something about the medium too is the visual aspect of it. I mean, the actors in the show are remarkable, and there's something that as talented as a writer as you are, it's something that no writer can do in terms of capturing the look on Anthony Boyle's face in a certain moment, or like the movement of his eyes, or the way that his eyebrow moves in a particular way that communicates so much. Like it really was. I mean, having loved the book so much, and I think the world of Say Nothing. It's one of my best nonfiction books I've ever read. And so it was. I came into I was excited that you were involved, but I was also emotionally prepared to be disappointed because I think that's my expectation with most books that I love is that it's so hard for the adaptation to to reach the same level and the same emotional level as the book. And I wouldn't the what I came away with was the two projects are very different. Um, but I was struck by how much I enjoyed it. And I think so much of that, obviously there's so hundreds of people who made that possible, but the acting and the things that they could do with their bodies and their faces to communicate things that just aren't possible on the page, I think took so many moments to a different created a different emotional register that was really striking for me.
I think that's so right. And I think that I mean, it's funny to go back to what I was saying about the idea of like carving away and distillation. This is the thing I notice is that you can also have a situation in which it is possible to convey the emotion in a half a page of dialogue or in, in a couplet. Um, but then when you're actually sitting there in the edit, you realize that like you don't have to because it's just there
Mm,
on the face, that the face is such an incredibly expressive instrument
yeah.
that it can do all of this stuff that at times can make dialogue, even really good dialogue, seem kind of
Mm,
leaden by comparison. No, I think another thing in terms of my education, uh, casting, there's an old saw about how 80% of directing is just casting.
mm,
And I don't know that that's true. I mean, I think it was incredible to watch these directors work up close. But we worked with a really amazing casting director, this woman Nina Gold in London, who, if there are journalists on here, and I feel like I already pitched this at the New Yorker and nobody took me up on it. Somebody needs to write a profile of this woman, Nina Gold. She's the most amazing casting director, and the way she works, she did, Game of Thrones and the Crown and a whole series of other shows. Really, really extraordinary at what she does, and she worked with people in Belfast, and we were trying to cast, unknown people as often as possible. Um, and thinking a lot about kind of the specifics of faces. And I had felt very strongly coming in, I don't want this to be a show, with a bunch of like American and English movie star type
mm,
people putting on bad Belfast accents. And
mm,
so I think that all of that is how you end up with these young incredible actors who I think in a lot of cases will not have been familiar to people before. And then some of what you're talking about on Anthony Boyle's face, some of that is the fact that Anthony Boyle is from West Belfast. Anthony Boyle
yeah.
is from Ballymurphy. Like he grew up in these streets. Lola Pettigrew, who plays young Dolores, knew Anthony growing up because Lola is from West Belfast. And that kind of the way in which they don't need to learn it, and also the
Mm,
way in which they came into this project with a lot of skin in the game, because if it if it sucked, they were going to have to go back and face their own families. And so having a lot of people on the production who for whom this is very, very close to home
mm.
mattered a lot.
I think that's such an important point because I think we're in this political era in which there can be this really reductive sense of in which like identity politics are reduced to this sort of like yeah, the pejorative woke, like, oh, there's no creative freedom. Only people who can, who have experienced certain things can, and can become the most reductive version of itself in ways that completely deny so much of what you're saying, which is that there is certainly creative autonomy and creative freedom, and for people having the opportunity to play different roles that exist outside the context of their own lives is very important. And some of the best roles in television and film history have been that, been people playing roles that exist beyond their own identities. And there is something to be said for people who have skin in the game, as you said, who for people who for whom this is part of their lineage, part of their family, part of their history, part of their community, who feel a sense of responsibility. There is something there. It's not the only thing, but it is something that adds to what an actor might be able to bring to a role. And I should also say, for folks who have questions, like me, I have so many questions, and we'll never have enough time. But if you have questions for Patrick, please put them in the I think there's a little place to put your questions at the bottom. I will read those toward the end of our conversation, and so it's an opportunity for you to get your burning questions about the book or the series um, in front of Patrick. We've kind of alluded to this, but I'm really curious, and I know you took this very seriously, what it meant to make a show about people who are still alive, and how you went embedded within that question, both what it means to make a show about people who are still alive, and whose family, obviously, and for those who aren't still alive, their families are, their kids are, um, and also how this show thinks about whether it considers itself a work of historical fiction, or whether, and within that, what are the sort of creative liberties that you all allowed yourself, but and how did you balance that out with sort of empirical and adherence to empiricism and what actually happened? And I mean, that part of the show is about truth being this thing that's not necessarily empirical in the way, but I'm really curious about that. How you all conceived of the show, and whether it was like this has to be fact checked in the same way that your book would, or if there's something about the medium that allows for more flexibility than there otherwise would be.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked about this. I mean, because it's a matter on which I have a lot of thoughts. Uh, yeah, listen, I think every time, every time a new season of The Crown comes out, there is a round of pearl clutching and editorializing about, um, it didn't happen just like that. That conversation never happened. Um, and to me, it's a little bit overblown because I think that most consumers, most viewers are pretty sophisticated at this stage and understand that when they watch a drama, and at the beginning it says based on a true story, that there is some degree of fictionalizing that is taking place. That what you are seeing is not a verite documentary. It is a drama in which the kind of elements of a story have been, the elements of true history have been arranged into a narrative story, and that some license has been taken. And obviously, there's more license taken in some cases than in others. Um, we could talk about the semantics of, are you saying this is based on a true story? Is it inspired by a true story? Is this a true story? Three different cards that you see in front of different things. But I think generally speaking, if it says based on a true story, people understand that it is not nonfiction in the way that, say, my book is, or an article in the Atlantic or the New Yorker is. Um, that said, it was my feeling that there are going to be all kinds of places where you have to kind of color in and embroider because two people walk into a room and we know they walked into the room and we know they walked out and we know that a decision was made in the room. We have no idea what they talked about in the room. I'm perfectly comfortable with a room of, a team of smart writers imagining what that conversation was. Um, there are instances in the series. I mean, there's a very dramatic moment um, in one of the later episodes in which Helen McConville, the grown daughter of Jean McConville, uh, sees one of the abductors who took her mother away back in 1972 in a church choir, and she confronts the priest about it. Didn't happen. Invented by the writers. But what that one brief, powerful scene does is it pulls together actually kind of three or four different stories that did happen, and I write about in my book, and finds a kind of essential dramatic truth. So, on the one hand, um, somebody could absolutely go through and say, well, wait a second, fact check, this is invented. On the other hand, in terms of the kind of all of the emotional dynamics or what's happening, all of that is true, and kind of incontestable. And I think what's happened is that the writers have made a kind of necessary choice to streamline and kind of deliver things through, in this case, one particular point of view, which is the point of view of somebody we've already been following, because you can't have a diffuse thing where you're hopping from one grown McConville child to another. Um, the so there are a series of things like that, where you're having to kind of color, but color between the lines. In terms of making a story about people who are still alive and their families are still alive. I think it's I think it is a sometimes a fraught thing to do.
Mm,
I think that um, it is incumbent on people like us to tell these stories with as much rigor and sensitivity as we can, to do outreach to the families of the victims, which we did in this case. But I also think that you're not asking for permission from people who the story is about, however much compassion you might feel for them. And you're not giving editorial control to anyone
mm,
necessarily. And I tend to think when I look at other dramas that are out there, and don't even get me started on these new kind of like the Netflix documentary in which the subject of the documentary is an executive producer on the series. Um, I think that that if you are going to tell one of these stories and you overly involve the real people who it is about, that can generally have pretty deleterious effects
yeah,
for the story that you're telling for a variety of reasons. So I think what you need to do is make something you feel like you can stand by. Do
yeah,
so with as much compassion and sensitivity as possible, but really kind of keep your eyes on that. And I think we told the story responsibly, and I feel good about where we came out.
got it. Is that ever, and this touches on something you and I have talked about before, but like, is it ever hard for you to, because I think there's this sense of knowing what is true and knowing that it's something you can stand by. Um, it's also true. I mean, this show has received remarkable reviews from so many places, as it should. And there are some people who are depicted in the show, um, who feel betrayed, who feel upset about the way that they were depicted, uh, to varying degrees. And do those things and this is something that I mean, you write about people who are involved in all sorts of, across your work, like involved in all manner of shady business, make a euphemism. As like so I know Patrick the writer is like, this is what I can stand by, this is what's true, this is what happened, I've got the receipts, I've got the archives, I've got the documents. Like, as Patrick the person, um, is that ever tough, like a tough part to sit with, or are you just like, this is part of the business?
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, I think that and this would be true with my journalism as well. It's often the case that on a kind of human interpersonal level, you develop feelings for the people that you write about, and I think unless if you're doing it right, I like to think you're going to develop a kind of well of compassion for a lot of these people, on which you sort of need to draw on when you're writing. Um, but I have always felt that when you sit down to write, and this would be as true for writing a TV show as it would for writing a book or an article, um, you cannot feel as though you are writing for them.
Yeah,
It is not for them. And the minute that you allow yourself to feel like it is, I think you're kind of doing a disservice to your readers and probably to the truth, because in truth, most of us, and this would be true, just as true for you and for me, right? Like most of us, given the opportunity, if there's a story about us in our lives that's out there, you're going to want to sculpt it here and there, kind of leave out this particular unflattering detail, airbrush that one away, say, if I had the chance, I wish I hadn't said that actually in that moment. It's the most natural human urge in the world. I think that when you are telling a story, you cannot be too beholden to that kind of retroactive impulse
yeah,
to edit on the part of the people that you're writing about. And so, yeah, personally, that can be a struggle. Professionally, I feel fine with it. I mean, again, I think you need to be able to stand by what you made,
of course.
and that's the most important thing. But as long as I do, I feel fine with it.
Got it. I have one more question before we hop into the audience Q&A. And and if you have not submitted a question yet, you still have an opportunity to, please do so at the bottom of your screen. Um, The disclaimer at the ends of the episode. Um, that's if you've not watched the show, Jerry Adams, who's very central to the story, is still a politician in Ireland who is very well known. Uh, Very celebrated by many for much of his body of work. There's a disclaimer that says Jerry Adams essentially, I'm paraphrasing, denies ever being a part of the IRA. And it's just, I don't know if it was meant this way, but like my wife and I, as we were watching it, we kept laughing. We kept laughing at it. And so, because you see what happens in the show. And then at the end, is it at the end or the beginning? I can't.
So the end,
It's
yeah.
at the end. And then at the end of each episode, disclaimer, Jerry Adams denies ever having, and it was so, was that meant to be? Did you all know that that was going to have this sort of strange kind of
Yeah.
comedic element to it? Or was that just like legal was like, look, you got to have that in there?
Yeah, it's funny. I am maybe more than the next person. I'm really I can really get into the kind of the poetry of denials, you know.
Mm,
And in my pieces, there are certain pieces of mine where the people I'm writing about are just kind of denying everything. And so
mm,
you'll get these like parenthetical denials like studded through the piece. And I've
yeah.
always thought that it becomes a kind of like contrapuntal music at a certain point,
Mm,
right? Where it's just like you get these refrains of their denials, and the denials, I think, often on the part of the person issuing the denials or insisting on them, the denial often ends up actually having the opposite effect of what you want, right? It
yeah.
starts to kind of diminish your credibility. In the case of the Adams denials, we did not want to have a denial at the end of every episode. And it's kind of a spoiler in a weird way
Mm,
because it's a big moment in the series when Jerry Adams first denies that he was ever in the IRA, and you go to Brendan Hughes's face, seeing that
yeah.
on television and reacting. And we've kind of stepped on it by putting these denials on all the episodes leading up to that. This was a legal decision, not made by me, and I wasn't really party to the decision. It was kind of handed down. But I will say it's one of those funny things where if we had just from a purely creative base on a purely creative ground said, wouldn't it be kind of cool and hilarious just as a cosmic joke to have at the end of every episode, Jerry Adams denies that he was ever in the IRA, just after you've watched an episode in which he's doing all this IRA
Yeah.
stuff?
Yeah.
It would have been over egging it. You know, people would have said, "Oh no, that's a little too
Too much.
avant-garde for
I
what we
think it
do."
worked, man. It was,
But it
it
came
was,
out. No, I think it was a legal decision with interesting creative. What was I saying earlier about creative alchemy? You know, sometimes
yeah,
somebody else comes up with something you could never
exactly.
have dreamed of.
Somebody on legal always wanted to be on SNL. That's what it was.
Exactly, exactly.
Thank you to those of you who submitted questions thus far. One person is asking, related to casting, you did so much research. Were you looking for fast meals of look or spirit?
Oh, what a great question. Probably more spirit. I mean, one of the things that was interesting was Jerry Adams was in some respects the toughest person to cast, right? Because he was the only person who a lot of people know what he looks like and what he sounds like. And Josh Finan, the guy who plays him really brilliantly as a young man, Josh, sent in a little audition tape, and there was just something about Josh is not from Belfast. People in Belfast are astonished by how well he nailed Jerry's accent and his
Hmm,
voice. Um, but there was something about the way he held his head and the way he kind of wielded his voice. He's got this amazing baritone, like a weapon,
hmm,
the kind of power of oration. Um, and Lola is an interesting example. So one of our lead directors is this guy, Mike Lennox, who's also a producer on the show. Mike is from Belfast. Mike directed every episode of Derry Girls. And Mike has been working with Lola. He worked with Lola and Anthony when they were like really young, when they were like 15 years old, on a kind of it was like a community, I think it was like a stay off of drugs, like PSA type thing. And Mike had said from the very beginning, I think Lola Pettigrew is Dolores Price, and that was a pretty easy one. And there it was both the spirit and the look. But just to give you one more example, another person who we just saw a tape and it knocked us out. The guy who plays Joe Linsky, who, if you remember, is he's the former monk who joins the IRA and then has disappeared. He's friends with Dolores, and he's this kind of older guy who she becomes close with, and then she has to drive to his death. it was an actor named Adam Best, um, who I don't know if Adam had had roles that are that big before. It's
Mm,
really just a kind of an arc in this one episode. But the read was so powerful. And Joe Linsky is a guy who we don't know a huge amount about what he was like as a personality, but I felt as though Adam kind of found a voice for this guy,
mm.
even just in this audition tape. And so, yeah, I found the whole casting process really thrilling.
That's awesome. I also mispronounced that word. It's facsimile. I said facsimiles because
There you go.
I'm teaching my 5-year-old how to read. That's what I'll blame it on. Um, from Kate, how did you identify for yourself, but also with your collaborators? Which themes from the book were essential to retain on the screen?
We had a meeting early on when Josh Zedemer, who's the showrunner and the head writer for the show, came on board. Josh was somebody who had worked with Brad Simpson in the past. Josh was somebody I had read his scripts and admired him. We actually share an agent in LA, and so I had known who he was for years. Um, and when he came on board, he was just incredibly kind of thoughtful in terms of immersing himself in this world and reading the book, but then reading way beyond the book. And we all had there was a week when I flew out to LA, and Josh and Brad and Nina and I just kind of shut ourselves in a room for a week with a whiteboard. And we went through in a really collaborative way, just figuring out what are the big story points that we want to focus on, and then what are the themes. And Josh, I think, put it really beautifully early on, and he said, to me, this whole story is about these young people and this collision for them between their politics and their humanity.
Mm, mm. Another question. Consent granted for the Boston tapes is such an interesting part of your book. I wonder how that part of the story applies to adapting the book to television, which is something I
Um,
was also curious about. The Belfast tapes.
yeah.
They said Boston tapes. They mean the Belfast tapes. Or I guess are they the Boston tapes? The are
Well,
they
it's, I mean, they're
that
referred to
Boston?
they're referred to as both.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the this is one of those areas where I think we all knew from early on. I was sad about this, but we knew from early on that um the whole kind of battle for the Boston tapes and
Mm,
all of the stuff with Boston College and these agreements that were made with these people who gave this testimony, their understanding when they gave this testimony that it wasn't going to be released, and then um, all of the kind of the sort of political maneuvering around these tapes. I think it was pretty evident to us early on that that was not going to be a part of the series. And I just think that there are things that you can do on the bigger canvas of a book
yeah.
where, in some ways, for me, writing a book like this, that's an incredibly welcome turn of events because it gives you a place to go
Mm,
in the last section of the book. It takes this story that has felt historical and brings it right into the messy present. It puts you in a totally different milieu.
mm,
Um, Boston College, academia, thinking about
mhm,
oral history and, literally kind of mutual legal assistance treaties between the US and the UK and should the State Department intervene and all these kinds of questions. As a as somebody writing a book, I always welcome the the opportunity to kind of swing into a completely different universe, like a world that feels very different from the place that we've been. I think that those, both as a writer and as a reader, I find those kinds of transitions very refreshing and
yeah.
they keep me engaged and absorbed and on my toes. In a series, the whole nature of a television series, a limited television series, is that emotionally it has to be kind of narrowing and narrowing and
Mm,
narrowing and narrowing, through the last third. It's just got to be sort of tightening and tightening and tightening the
mhm,
focus. And if we had broken away to entertain those types of questions any more
yeah.
than we did, I just think it would have kind of broken the spell
Yeah.
emotionally. It would be very hard to get people to care in episode 7
Yeah.
about the fate of those tapes. And so it's there, but in a very kind of light way, only in as much as it's needed to service the sort of fundamental drama of Dolores Price speaking out and Jerry Adams being thrown into jeopardy by the existence of these tapes.
In a weird way, you're kind of finding me in the midst of a similar sort of moment. We're adapting my previous book, How the Word is Passed, into a book for young readers. And so I'm currently in the midst of, and what I was doing before this and what I'll do after I get off is um, going through the manuscript that I've worked with the adapter and the editor um, to take this book, about the history of slavery in America and adapt it for 8 to 12 year olds. And to you talking about a part of the book that was so interesting to me, like as someone who, got a PhD and was in academia, as somebody who is fascinated by the politics of that and the ethics of how and when certain contracts, social contracts are broken. I mean, and I mean that is and could be its own book. Um, but to your point, it's how do you is that going to uh distract from the sort of narrative propulsion to keep the story going and to keep it tight, as you've said. And it's a similar thing when you're similar but different, like for kids, one of the things that I took very seriously was capturing the sort of historiography of slavery, as much of the historiography of slavery as I could. This scholar said this, and that's in conversation with this. An 18th century scholarship on slavery is different than 20th century scholarship on slavery in this way, and we have to thread these things together.
But for
9 year old
eight-year
doesn't.
olds,
Yeah, 8, 9 year old, you gotta let it go. So it's been an interesting experience for myself in streamlining. I'm going to ask one last question since we're coming toward the end of our time. We have this is our second. Is Painkillers based off? Is it technically based on Empire of Pain or like
it's not technically based on Empire of Pain. It's based on my original article about the Sackler family, and then also on Barry Meyer's terrific book, Painkiller.
okay, okay. Well, we have had two fantastic and different adaptations of your work. Are there other Patrick Radden Keefe adaptations that we can expect in the coming months and years and
Years, not months. Years, not months. The Yeah, we're working on the Snakehead right now. My second book, The Snakehead, is set up at A24, and on that one, I'm working with a really wonderful writer, Anna Oyang Munch, who's a playwright, and has written on a bunch of great shows, from Beef to Severance, and she's um, she's gonna write it, and so we've been talking about that, and we're sort of now in that like whiteboard phase of breaking it down. What's the story? That one we're planning on telling over multiple seasons, so it's
oh
fun.
wow. Are you
Yeah,
going to be as involved in that one as you will be in this
it's
one?
looking that way. Yeah, yeah, which should be which that one I'm co-creating with her. So, but she'll
Ah,
she'll write it. So, yeah, so it's been fun to be in there. And again, I'm kind of dazzled by the things she's coming up with. So,
you're just a regular old Hollywood guy now.
hey man, I don't know. Listen, I got a book to finish. So,
I hear you. I hear you. Well, thank you so much.
thank you.
It's always so fun talking to you. We could do this
You too.
forever. Thank you to everybody who has come and joined us. If you have, I cannot emphasize enough. If you have not gotten this book, please get the book. If you have not watched the series, please watch the series. Do both. Start a book club. Bring it to your book club. Bring it to your TV club, which maybe is just you and your partner on the couch, which is what my TV club is. And yeah, this was a delight. Shout out to New America. Shout out
Yeah,
to
thanks, New America.
Emily
Thank you
and
so
Sarah
much,
and
man.
everybody behind this. And we'll see you soon.
Great to talk.
Bye.
Thank you all. We'll see ya.